Today we're going to be talking about how to solve quadratic functions by factoring. So by the end of today's lesson, you're going to be able to answer the questions. What does it mean to solve a quadratic equation? And how many solutions can a quadratic equation have? Solving a quadratic equation or function just means finding the x-intercept. So we want to know when the output is 0, so when y is 0, what is the x value? Solutions to a quadratic function have several different names and we can use them interchangeably. So solution, zero, root, and x-intercept, they all mean exactly the same thing. And there's three types of solutions that a quadratic function can have. You can have no solutions where the parabola does not cross the x-axis. You can have one solution where the parabola only touches the x-axis one time, or you can have two solutions where it touches the x-axis twice. There's a bunch of different ways that we can solve quadratic functions. Okay, we can graph it. Every single quadratic function can be graphed. You can factor the quadratic equation to figure out the zeros. That's what we're going to be discussing today. The only thing is that not all quadratic equations can factor. So the other methods that we'll talk about later on in this unit is the square root method. Completing the square, you're going to do that in Algebra 2, and then the quadratic formula. So when we are choosing to solve a quadratic equation by factoring, we have to make sure that that equation is equal to 0. Remember, we're trying to find the x-intercept, so when the y is equal to 0, we need to know the x value, so it has to be equal to 0. Then we're going to factor it, and remember, we always look for a GCF first, and then once we factor it, we can set the binomials equal to 0 and solve for the x, and that will tell us where it crosses the x-axis.
Okay guys, so here's an example of how to find your solutions by using factoring. The first thing you need to check for is that your quadratic equation is set equal to 0, and I see right here that it is set equal to 0, so that's perfect. Alright, so I'm going to go ahead and try to tic-tac-toe this guy, but first we check for a greatest common factor. I know this one will not have a greatest common factor because this is a 1x squared. Anytime I see a 1 in there, I know the only number that goes into 1 is 1. So there's no point to check for a greatest common factor. I'm going to go ahead and tic-tac-toe this. So x squared, 14, and a minus 9x. Okay, so before we continue, let's go ahead and decide, will my signs be the same or will they be different? Well, I look at my very last sign and I see that it's a plus sign. If it's a plus, that tells me my signs will be the same. And that means it could be a plus plus or it could be a minus minus. And the way I can determine which it is I look at my first sign, or you can look right here. I know I want to end up negative, so I know it has to be a minus minus. Okay, now we need to find my factors of x squared. Well, the only factors of x squared will be x times x. My factors of 14 are 1 and 14. And I flip-flop 14 and 1, 2 and 7, and 7 and 2. And that's all of them. So this one's easy because there's only one option, so I go ahead and fill it in, x, x. And now I have 4 options here that I have to choose from. Well, I know if I'm trying to get to a 9, I'm going to try this guy right here. And we multiply across. X times 2 is 2x. I multiply across the bottom. X times 7 is 7x. We said both signs have to be minuses, so a negative and a negative, and then we check. We add these together to make sure they give us a negative 9x. Well, negative 2x plus a negative 7x does give me a negative 9x. So I have it right. I just need to slide my signs over. So this minus slides over here. This minus slides over here. And now all I have left to do is crisscross. So one of my factors is x minus 7. And my other factor is x minus 2. All right, so now that we have my factors, I'm going to use those factors to find the solutions. Well, to do that, I'm going to take each one of these factors individually, make it equal 0, and solve. So first I'm going to take x minus 7 and set it equal to 0 and solve. Well, I know to solve, to get rid of a negative, we need to add. So I add 7 to both sides. So I have x is equal to 0 plus 7 is 7. All right, so that's going to be one of my solutions. So now I take my other factor, which is x minus 2, make it equal to 0, and then I solve. To get rid of a minus 2, we add 2 to both sides. And I get x is equal to a positive 2. All right, so these are my factors. And I have two solutions. So I can write my two solutions just like I did, or you can write your answer in bracket form. My solutions are, you put a little bracket, and you want to put them in numerical order. So to be proper, I'm going to put 2 first, and then I'll put my 7. Sorry, that bracket was really ugly. Okay, we're going to try this one again. The first thing, if I want to find my solutions by factoring, I have to make sure that it's set equal to 0, which it is. All right, now I look for a greatest common factor. Well, I know this is a 1x squared, so I don't have to worry about it. I can go ahead straight tic-tac-toe. I know my signs are going to be different because the last sign is a minus sign, which literally means difference. So one has to be a plus, one has to be a minus. My factors of x squared are x times x. My factors of 5 are 1 and 5 and 5 and 1. So I go ahead and put my x and my x, and I'm going to try 1 and 5. I multiply across. X times 1 is 1x. X times 5 is 5x. Okay, well remember we want to end up negative and my signs must be different. So if I want to end up negative, I know the bigger number has to be negative. So I'm going to give my 5 the negative and the 1 a positive. Because I know a positive 1x plus a negative 5x, these two right here will add together to give me negative 4x. So I found it. What I need to do is slide my signs over and then crisscross. So one of my factors is x minus 5, the other factor is x plus 1. Okay, so now we did all this, so we can use these factors to help me find the solutions, to find where it will cross the x-axis. So to do that, I'll take one factor at a time. I'm going to take x minus 5, and I'm going to set it equal to 0 and solve. To get rid of a minus 5, I add 5 to both sides. So I have x is equal to 0 plus 5, which is 5. So I know it's going to touch the x-axis at 5. All right, let's find my other one. So I'm going to take this factor, x plus 1, and set it equal to 0. To solve, to get rid of a plus 1, I take away a 1 from both sides. So it's going to give me x equals 0 minus 1 is a negative 1. All right, so I have my two solutions. I know this parabola will cross the x-axis at 5 and also at negative 1. So I can leave my answers written that way, or I can write it in brackets. So to be proper, we put it in numerical, the small number first, so negative 1, comma, 5. Close my bracket. And it's okay if your brackets are ugly like mine. Just try. Just don't use a parenthesis because they mean different things. Okay, so the first thing we do is we make sure that it's set equal to 0, which it is. All right, so now we're going to check for a greatest common factor. Well, I see a 1x, so anytime I see a 1, I know I don't have to worry about the greatest common factor, so I go straight to tic-tac-toe. I look at my last sign, which is a minus, which tells me my signs will be different. I know one of them has to be a plus, one of them has to be a minus. My factors of 2x squared are 2x times x. My factors of 6 are 1 times 6, 6 times 1, 2 times 3, 3 times 2. Well, there's only one option here, so go ahead and fill that in. And I have 4 options here, so you might have to go through some trial and error. The first one I'm going to start with is this 2 and 3. And I'm going to multiply across. 2x times 2 is 4x. X times 3 is 3x. It's looking pretty good because I know I'm trying to get to a 1x. Well, I know if these two numbers, if I subtract them, will give me a 1. Okay, but let's pay attention to our signs. Notice here I want to end up positive, so I need more positive, so I give the bigger one the plus sign. So plus goes here. And I always check a positive 4x and a negative 3x. These two numbers do add together to give me a positive 1. So I found it. I'm going to slide my plus sign over, and I'm going to slide my minus sign over. And from here we crisscross. So I know one of my factors is 2x minus 3. And my other factor is x plus 2. Okay, so now that we found our factors, we're going to set them each equal to 0 to find the solution, to find where will this parabola touch the x-axis. Okay, so I'm going to take this 2x minus 3 and set it equal to 0. Okay, my first step will get rid of a minus 3, and to do that I need to add 3 to both sides. So that's going to give me 2x is equal to 0 plus 3 is 3. Sorry, that's ugly. Okay, x is not by itself. This time I have to get rid of this 2. Well, that's touching the x, which means 2 times x. The opposite of times is divide, so I'm going to divide both sides by 2. So I know x is equal to 3 halves. If you want to, you could put it as a decimal as well. 1.5 is fine as well. So I know it's going to cross the x-axis at 3 halves, aka cross it out 1.5. All right, so that's one of my solutions. So now I'm going to go take my other factor and set it equal to 0. So x plus 2. To get rid of a plus 2, I take away 2 from each side. And that's going to give me x is equal to 0 minus 2 is a negative 2. So there's my ugly bracket. And I'm going to put my answers in numerical order. So first I'm going to put the negative 2, comma, then I'm going to put my 3 halves. Remember, if you want to put 1.5, that's fine. Okay. On this one, the first thing we do is we try to make sure that it's set equal to 0, which on this one, it's not. So my first step is to make it equal 0. So to make it equal 0, right now it's equal to negative 20. So if I want it to equal 0, to get rid of a negative 20, I add 20. And remember, what I do on one side, I do on the other. I'm going to zoom in real quick. So remember, keep your like terms lined up. 20 is a constant, a regular number, so I put it under 30, which is also a constant, a regular number. Okay, so there are no other x squared, so those drop down. There are no other x's, so those drop down. $30 plus 20 is now 50, and it's set equal to 0. Cool. All right, so now it's equal to 0. So now I had to look for a greatest common factor. Well, does this one have a greatest common factor? Unfortunately, I do not see a 1 anywhere, so we might. So I see a 2, a 20, and a 50. So I have to think, what is the largest number that will go into all of those? Well, notice I see a 2, and this is even, and this is even. Well, I know 2 goes into all even numbers. So my greatest common factor will be a 2. So I'm going to divide everything by 2. So that's going to leave me with x squared. Negative 20x divided by 2 is going to give me a negative 10x. A positive 50 divided by 2 is going to give me a positive 25. I mean, even if you did 0 divided by 2, it's still 0. All right, so now that we took out the greatest common factor, this is what we're going to tic-tac-toe. Okay, I see here that my sign should be the same, which either means it has to be a plus plus or a minus minus. There's two ways we can tell. I could look at the first sign, or you can look at what we need to end up with. So I know they both have to be minus minus. My factors of x squared are x times x. My factors of 25 are 1 and 25, 25 and 1, and 5 times 5. All right, so I put x and x. And I have three options here to try out. Well, I know if I'm trying to get to a 10, I'm going to use my 5 and 5. I multiply across. X times 5 is 5x. X times 5 is 5x. We said both signs have to be minuses, so I stick them on there and then I check. Negative 5 plus a negative 5 does give me a negative 10. So I found it. I'm going to go ahead and slide my signs on over. And then I'm going to crisscross. So I know one of my factors is x minus 5 and the other factor is x minus 5. But when I write down my factors, we're going to be careful. We can't forget that we did have a greatest common factor we took out. So the first thing I write down is my 2. And then I'm going to write my factors, which is x minus 5 times x minus 5. Just as review, remember you can also write this as because when you square something, you multiply it by itself. So either way you write those, I would be okay with that. Okay, so now that we have our factors, now we're going to use those factors to find our solutions, to find where will it cross the x-axis. Well, guys, here on my factors, I have three different groups here. I have this term here and here. So 1, 2, 3. Okay, first of all, if one of your terms, one of your groups does not have a variable in it, you can just ignore it. So for example, this only has a 2 right here, so I can ignore that. But if it said 2x, that's a different story, and we'll get to that in a little bit, okay? But since this is just a number, there is no variable next to it, I can ignore this piece, okay? All right, so let's move on to this guy. So I'm going to take x minus 5 and set it equal to 0. And then I'm going to solve. To get rid of a minus 5, I add 5 to both sides. Okay, so we got to ignore this guy. We solved this one. Okay, x minus 5 equals 0. To get rid of a minus 5, I add 5 to both sides. Well, obviously, if they're the exact same factor, we're going to get the same solution. Which what this means, guys, is it means since these are the same, it's only going to touch the x in one place. It's only going to touch at 5. So when I write my solutions in my bracket, I don't have to write 5 twice. It's actually going to be a parabola that looks something like this. And it's only going to, the parabola will only touch the x-axis one time here at 5. All right, last example. So remember, the first thing we need to do is make sure that it's set equal to 0, which it is not. So let's take care of that. Right now it's equal to 18x, so to get rid of that 18x, I'm going to subtract 18x from both sides. Sorry. This side cancels, so now it is equal to 0 over here. Okay, be careful, guys. I can't take this 4 and subtract this 18 because this is 4x squareds. This is telling me to take away 18x's. These are not like terms, so I'm going to have to write it long ways as 4x squared minus 18x. Okay, so the next thing we do is we look for a greatest common factor. So I see my numbers 4 and 18. I don't see a 1, so which means keep my eye out for greatest common factor. Well, the greatest number I can divide both a 4 and an 18 by and get a whole number is a 2. But that's not it. What else do they have in common? I know I could take 4 and 18 and divide both of them by 2, but notice I have an x squared and I have an x, which means they both have at least a single x in common. So their greatest common factor is 2x, so that's what I need to divide everything by. Okay, well here, 4 divided by 2 is 2. I'm going to go ahead and move my work over here. X squared divided by x is x. So 4x squared divided by 2x gives me 2x. Okay, now I need to take negative 18x and divide it by 2x. Well, the x's cancel. Negative 18 divided by 2 is a negative 9. Okay, so notice after I get done dividing by my greatest common factor, I no longer have a square, which means I don't have to tic-tac-toe it. There's no point of doing the tic-tac-toe. Okay, because notice my square is gone. All right, so this is my factor, but don't forget we took out a greatest common factor. So I'm going to write my greatest common factor first. And then when I did my division, I got 2x minus 9. Okay, so these are my factors. We're going to use these factors to find my solution. So remember, I have two groups here, here and here. Remember, if it's just a number by itself, you can ignore it. But this time 2 it's not just a number, it's 2x. So I'm going to take this 2x and set it equal to 0. Well, to get rid of this 2 that's touching the x, that means multiply. So to get rid of multiply, I divide both sides by 2. I get x is equal to 0 divided by 2, which is 0. Okay, so now I did this one, so now I'll move on here. 2x minus 9 is equal to 0. So to solve this one, I have to add 9 to both sides. My 2x drops down. 0 plus 9 is 9. To get rid of this 2, I have to divide both sides by 2. And I get 9 over 2. You can leave it as a fraction, or you can put it as 4.5, either one. Okay, so I know that this one has two solutions. It's going to cross the x-axis at 0. It also crosses again over at 4.5, or 9/2. So I'm going to write my answer in brackets. You put the small number first, which is 0, in numerical order, and then 9/2. All right. Good luck on your assignment, guys. Later.